Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's Charity Village webinar. We will get started in just a moment. We just want to make sure that everyone has a chance to join us before we begin the session. We have people tuning in from across the country today, which is excellent. It's so nice to have all of you here. And with that, we will go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to today's Charity Village webinar. My name is Mercedes and I'm the Marketing and Communications Manager with Charity Village. As we are gathering here on a virtual platform, it is important to acknowledge that each of us is joining this webinar from the ancestral or unceded lands of the Inuit, Métis, and First Nation people. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Anishinaabe, which includes the Ojibwe of Fort William First Nation. Please join us in a moment of reflection as we recognize the Indigenous peoples as the stewards of this land. Let's acknowledge the mistakes and harm in our history and the ongoing injustice, and contemplate tangible actions each of us can take to move forward in a spirit of truth, reconciliation, and collaboration. For those who may be joining a Charity Village webinar for the first time, Charity Village is Canada's largest online job board for the nonprofit sector. In addition to our online job board, organizations can also post volunteer positions. So if you are looking for work or to recruit talent in the sector, Charity Village is a great place to start. We also have a ton of excellent resources for nonprofit professionals, including online courses, articles, fundraising tools, and free webinars like the one we are presenting today. Before we start today's webinar, I would like to quickly run through some housekeeping items. You may have noticed when you joined the webinar that you were automatically put on mute. Since we have hundreds of participants in today's session, it is important for us to minimize the amount of background noise so that everyone can clearly hear the presentation. But you could still ask questions and make comments using the question box at the bottom of the Zoom control panel. Look for that at the bottom of your screen. You can also email your questions to webinars@charityvillage.com. We will be taking questions at the end of the webinar, so please submit your questions as you think of them, and we will do our best to get to as many as possible. If you happen to encounter any technical issues with the webinar, whether with viewing the presentation or with the audio, please let us know in the question box or by sending us an email. We will do our best to get any technical difficulties resolved as quickly as possible. But in a worst case scenario, please remember that we are recording today's webinar and we will send you the full recording by email tomorrow. So if you get called away or disconnected, you will still be able to view the full presentation. And with that, I would like to welcome our presenters for today, Omar Vizram and Shirley Wolf from Enkel Back Office Solutions. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having us today. We are so excited to be here. Today's topic is key financial metrics every nonprofit should track for long-term success. Just a little bit of detail about what you'll learn today. 1, what to track and how to track it. 2, why these metrics are so crucial for financial stability and growth. How to improve donor confidence through transparent reporting. Strategies to diversify revenue and manage cash flow. Tips for optimizing and managing administrative costs. Before I go further, I just wanted to get into a couple of housekeeping issues. 1, if you have questions throughout today's session, please enter those questions in the question and answer box, and please do feel free to provide your email address. If we do not get time to respond to your question today, we will be sure to reach out. Also, Shirley and I are located in an office where there is some fire alarm testing. And so we may have to go on mute for a couple of seconds if the noise gets too loud. So please do bear with us. This is completely out of our control, but we will get back up and running as soon as we can. Now, a little bit about Enkel. So I am the co-founder and head of growth at Enkel. I started Enkel in 2016, really with a simple problem in mind. And that problem is that you can't build a great organization without good books. Fast forward to today, we have about 300 clients, over 100 of which are not-for-profit organizations, including member-based associations and charities, a fairly diverse group of not-for-profit organizations. We focus on what we call financial operations support, bookkeeping, payroll, and more. Today, we're actually going to tell you more about the strategic guidance that we provide our clients through our CFO and controllership services. Also, before proceeding, I would like to acknowledge that our offices are situated on the unceded traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. As I mentioned, my name is Omar Vizram, and I'm the head of growth at Enkel. Joining me today is Shirley Wolf. Shirley is a CFO on our CFO and controllership services team. Now let's get into one of the most fun aspects of the webinar. How comfortable are you with the financial metrics for your organization? It's okay if it's a 0. I don't know which metrics. 1 to 3, I know which metrics matter, but I have no idea what the metrics look like for my organization. Or in the 4 to 5 range, I know the metrics that matter, we calculate them regularly, and I have confidence on where we stand overall. Looking forward to seeing the results. All right, some preliminary numbers here. Let's see. We have about 21% that are saying 0. I don't know which metrics matter. About 17% saying I know which metrics matter, but I have no idea what the metrics look like for my organization. About 14% as a 2 and a 3, so in that lower end of the scale. And then about 25% combined in the 4 to 5 range. So a pretty evenly mixed bag here, which is really great. So we have people of all different experience levels joining us today, which is really exciting. We're going to go right into another polling question. As you can tell, I love these polling questions. Which stakeholders review your financial metrics? Is it senior management, the board of directors, funders and donors? None, all of the above, or some of the above? Let us know. Okay. So I will start going through here. Senior management, 8%, board of directors, 21%, funders and donors, 1%. 4% said none. 19% said all of the above, and 48% said some of the above. So again, mixed bag. Thank you for sharing your responses. Let's move on. Okay. Now we're getting into the core of today's presentation. Why financial metrics matter. There is a famous quote from Peter Drucker: "What gets measured gets managed." And that can't be any more true. And so what you'll see today is a lot of metrics that not-for-profit organizations can use to help them take action. Let's dive in. So a little bit more on why metrics matter. So 1, ensuring longevity and sustainability, maximizing impact, trust, can't emphasize that enough, demonstrating financial stewardship and transparency, program efficiency and effectiveness. The reasons really may vary, and it depends on your organization, where you are. It also depends on the broader economic context. Before proceeding, I do want to pause here and really share some detail on why we created this content for you today. We are seeing many of our clients struggling. We're having many discussions with clients who are seeing their liabilities exceeding their current assets, effectively making them insolvent. The threat of tariffs, scarce talent, political change, these are things we can't control. However, at Enkel, we are so passionate. We really believe that with the right financial toolkit, NPOs will be able to better weather the storm. Also, very importantly, for what we will cover today, any kind of meaningful measurement that you implement in your organization, the foundation for it is always good bookkeeping. If you do not have effective bookkeeping processes and workflows in place, please reach out to us. That is really the foundation for any kind of meaningful measurement. Some important terms before we go farther: financial metrics and KPIs. So really, what is the difference here? Well, financial metrics help you reflect your nonprofit's overall financial stability and resilience. They help you monitor cash reserves, revenue diversity, and unrestricted net assets, as an example. They will really help you understand whether you have the capacity to weather the economic shifts and cover essential costs. What you'll find is in financial metrics, there are a lot of standard financial metrics that will apply to all of you. When we get into KPIs, key performance indicators, these measure the success of specific activities such as fundraising efficiency, program impact, and donor retention. So the relevant KPIs to you may vary depending on the nature of the work that you do. Tracking KPIs gives you actionable insights into the effectiveness of core initiatives, enabling you to refine strategies, set measurable, tangible goals, and to maximize the resources that you have. I find that KPIs generate a lot of really interesting conversation at the board level, particularly at this time of year when we're thinking about strategy and planning for our upcoming fiscal year. And with that, I would like to hand it off to my colleague, Shirley. Shirley, over to you.
Well, thank you, Omar, and good morning and good afternoon to all of our participants. It's a pleasure to be with you today. In our presentation, we've selected metrics and KPIs that we believe are relevant to most charities. There may be other metrics that are relevant to your organization, such as the debt to equity ratio, a debt service coverage ratio if your organization has borrowed money, or a return on investment ratio if your organization holds investments. Time won't allow us to focus on all of those metrics and KPIs today. The next slide shows a profit and loss statement for a fictitious organization making an impact charity. And as I go along in the presentation today, I'll be referring to this fictitious organization to illustrate the metrics and the KPIs that we'll be looking at today. So in this profit and loss statement, we've categorized the grant revenues of the organization into restricted and unrestricted grants, and the expenses into program, administrative, and fundraising expenses. And this has been done to enable us to calculate the different metrics. So you would need to similarly group the revenues and the expenses for your organization to calculate the metrics. So first up is the operating reserve ratio. This is calculated by dividing the unrestricted net assets of the organization by the average monthly expenses over a 12-month period. Monitoring this ratio helps to ensure the financial sustainability of the organization and to prepare for significant adverse circumstances, including a loss of revenue. It answers questions such as how long you can sustain operations without revenues and your level of preparedness if there was a financial crisis. Many boards establish an internally restricted fund, which may be called a contingency fund or an operating reserve fund, to set aside a portion of the unrestricted net assets that, in the absence of revenue, would allow the organization to continue and operate for a period of 3 to 6 months. So this creates a safety net in periods of economic downturns. According to a 2022 report from Imagine Canada, only 25% of Canadian nonprofits have adequate reserves, highlighting the need for improved financial preparedness. We recommend reviewing this ratio at least annually or after any major expenses or adverse changes in circumstances. For most of the metrics and KPIs we'll be reviewing today, the information you need to run the calculations can be accessed from your most recent monthly or annual financial statements. So it's important to ensure that the data used for the calculations is accurate so that you can see the true financial picture. So let's have a look and see what this ratio looks like for Make an Impact charity. Here we've excluded the fundraising expenses that I mentioned earlier from the calculation of the average monthly expenses for the year, since these are event-specific expenses and they would not occur in the absence of any revenues. So we worked through the numbers, and the ratio of 1.7 shows that the organization can cover less than 2 months with its unrestricted net assets. This may not be a sufficient buffer should the organization face financial difficulties. Next up is the program efficiency ratio. So this is calculated by dividing the organization's program expenses by its total expenses, and it measures how effectively the organization is using its resources to achieve its mission. Donors and funders often scrutinize this ratio to see how effectively their contributions support mission-driven activities. We recommend reviewing this ratio at least annually and during donor reporting periods, as it's a metric that donors are interested in. Maintaining a high ratio helps to secure future grants, and a ratio of 65% or higher is generally recommended. It would help to organize the expense accounts in your chart of accounts so that each account is used exclusively for either program, administrative, or fundraising expenses, and you could use a parent account to group them accordingly. So again, what does this ratio look like for Make an Impact charity? So the chart on the screen tracks the charity's cumulative program and total expenses on a monthly basis. The green line represents the organization's program expenses, and the blue line represents the total expenses. So you can see that they are trending in the same way throughout the year. The organization's ratio is looking good at just over 83%. As we'll see on a later slide, the majority of Make an Impact's revenues are restricted, so we would expect a high ratio. And importantly, the organization can demonstrate to its donors that it's spending at the expected portion of its total expenses on its programs. The next ratio that we're going to look at is the fundraising efficiency ratio. And of course, this is particularly relevant to organizations that hold fundraising events. This is calculated by dividing the organization's fundraising expenses by its fundraising revenues. If there are multiple fundraising events, the ratio should be calculated for each fundraising event, because it helps to evaluate if funds are being raised efficiently and cost effectively. And it will also help your organization to make decisions about future events. Many nonprofits aim to keep the ratio at a maximum of 30% to maintain donor confidence. And again, we're going to take a look at a gala fundraising event that was held by Make an Impact. As you'll see, the expenses for the event were over $75,000, and they represented almost half of the revenues that were raised. The costs were higher than management expected, and so they're certainly going to evaluate whether the costs can be reduced for a future event. or a future similar event, or if they in fact would want to plan for a different event. So they're able to get better leverage. The next slide looks at revenue diversification. And in periods of uncertainty, more and more charities are looking to diversify their revenues. So there's less dependency on one stream of revenue or one funder. A diverse revenue base provides greater financial stability by reducing the risks associated with changes to any single fundraising stream, and it does promote the long-term sustainability of the organization. So we recommend reviewing your organization's revenue diversity at least annually when reviewing your strategy and when you're planning for the next fiscal year. So we have a pie chart that shows the revenue diversity for Make an Impact. So you'll see that approximately 85% of the revenues are in the form of restricted grants. So what we did was to break that down, and we noticed that there are about 16 different grants that make up the restricted grants total. And they are all from different funders. So the organization doesn't have a dependency on one funder. It is, however, always best to increase your level of unrestricted revenues because it does allow for more flexibility. And that's what the organization did. They chose to hold the fundraising event to raise those additional unrestricted funds because their donations and fees for services revenues were only a very small portion of the overall revenues. The organization intended to build its unrestricted net assets, and in the future, they can then have the resources to take advantage of new opportunities that may present themselves. We're now going to take a look at unrestricted net assets. So unrestricted net assets is essentially calculated by deducting total liabilities, externally restricted net assets, and permanently restricted net assets, such as endowment funds, from the organization's total assets. So it represents funds that the organization can use at its discretion on the mission of the organization. It provides flexibility to cover additional or unforeseen operating costs and to adapt to the financial needs and opportunities. Unfortunately, many organizations lack sufficient unrestricted net assets, which limits their ability to respond to risks and opportunities. We recommend reviewing your organization's unrestricted net assets at least annually when reviewing your strategy and planning for the next year. It's also helpful to monitor the trend in your unrestricted net assets year on year. So for Make an Impact Charity, we have done a comparison of the unrestricted net assets of the organization for the current year compared to the previous year. So you'll see that the balance was very low at the end of the previous year. The organization's a relatively new organization. They didn't hold a fundraising event in the previous year, and other unrestricted revenues such as donations were relatively low. So there's been a significant increase in the balance year on year, and this is enabling the organization to better respond to financial headwinds and opportunities. Our next ratio is the contribution to fixed assets. And this ratio is calculated by dividing the organization's fixed expenses by total revenues. This metric helps you to assess whether your revenues are sufficient to cover essential costs such as salaries, rent, and administrative expenses. Charities may face cash flow challenges, and it helps to understand how revenue supports fixed costs that are essential to sustain operations. We recommend reviewing your organization's ratio monthly or quarterly. You would need to review your expense accounts to identify which expenses are fixed in nature in order to calculate this ratio. So we went through that exercise of identifying the fixed expenses for Make an Impact. And as you'll see on the next chart, the fixed expenses are just under $750,000, and the total revenue is just under $1.4 million. So this results in a contribution to fixed assets ratio of 53.6%. So this ratio to me indicates that there is a good buffer, that the charity does expect to sustain its operations in the future, even if faced with funding cuts. And I'm now going to hand over to Omar for our next polling question.
Thank you, Shirley. Water break for Shirley time. Polling question is, how high of a priority is financial transparency for your organization in the current economic climate? A scale of 1 to 10, 1 being not at all, 5 being moderate, and 10 being high priority. Let's see what you have to say. Okay. Wow. So we are very heavily weighted on 8, 9, and 10. My math serves me right. 70% of people, actually, if you capture 7 to 10, it's 80% of our attendees today are saying that this is high priority. So definitely a lot of interest in this topic, which I'm really happy to see. Really, this is the foundation. This will help you, as we've said, weather the storm. So really happy to see that there's so much interest in this. Thank you. All right, Shirley, back over to you for key performance indicators.
Thank you. So we're going to look at 2 key performance indicators. The first one being the donor retention rate. So firstly, I would like to just say that KPIs are often compared to benchmarks or targets that the organization sets for a fiscal year or as part of its longer planning. So as you think about the KPIs that you would like to use for your organization, take in mind what you would like to achieve. So donations are often a very important source of revenue for charities, and attracting and retaining donors is critical to the sustainability and the growth of the organization. Attracting new donors can be more costly than retaining existing donors. So it's usually really worth putting the effort in to build the relationships with your existing donors. The donor retention rate is a helpful measure of the donors that continue to give over time. And the KPI is calculated by dividing the number of repeat donors compared to the previous year by the total number of donors in the current year. So a high ratio suggests that the organization has strong relationships with its donors, whereas a low ratio may indicate areas where engagement should be improved. You could also look at the donor retention over periods that are longer than a year, such as 3 or 5 years, and compare to targets for longer-term donor retention as well. Coming back to our Make an Impact charity, this next slide shows a pie chart, and you will see that the new donors in this fiscal year were 150, accounting for 23% of the total donors, and the repeat donors were at 77%. And the charity has been successful by exceeding its target retention rate of 75%. And then next up is the administrative cost ratio. And this is calculated by dividing the organization's administrative expenses by its total expenses. Many organizations target a ratio in the range of 10 to 15%, which demonstrates effective management without excessive overhead costs. Although I have noted that it has been challenging to achieve this target, particularly in recent years of high inflation. Program grants typically allow for an administrative expense allocation that's within this range of 10 to 15%. Monitoring this ratio at least annually will help to ensure that you're not spending too much on administration and enable you to make decisions that optimize these expenses. Again, donors often scrutinize administrative spending, and keeping this ratio within a reasonable range will improve donor confidence and the organization's ability to fundraise. So let's see what this ratio looks like for Make an Impact. In this chart, we have administrative expenses that are in the green line, and they total just over 131,000. And the total expenses are in the blue line, and they are at just under $1,239,000. So we calculated the administrative cost ratio at 10.6%. So we can see that this falls within that targeted range of 10 to 15%. And I'm now going to hand back to Omar to walk us through a financial report.
Okay, thank you, Shirley. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open the complete report that we have prepared for Making an Impact charity, which is a fictitious charity. But just to give you an idea of what our clients at Enkel, if they do engage us for this service, what the reporting package looks like. And as you'll see on a later slide, we deliver this either on a quarterly basis or a monthly basis. But I'll just scroll through really quickly. And this can be a very useful report, of course, for communicating what's happening inside the organization to the stakeholders, the board, the finance committee. It can really give one view of everything finance related and numbers related, so that really great conversations can occur about what needs to happen in the organization. So the report starts with highlights, and these are carefully curated by your Enkel controller. And these are, comments specifically highlighting the numbers in the report that are noteworthy, that stakeholders are going to want to look at, and that may be cause for concern or opportunity. This is the income statement. Often what happens here is we take if you're using QuickBooks Online, we take the income statement and we're able to condense it to a level that's a little bit more digestible on one page. For instance, we might combine certain expense accounts just to give a more concise, high-level view of what's happening in the organization. This is the balance sheet, of course, an important report. Again, this is done at a summarized level. This is an example of some of the metrics that you might look at, that you might receive in your report. For instance, this one here shows your current liabilities versus your current assets. This is a cash flow report. Cash flow, of course, is of high interest, we're finding, particularly right now. And so there's a number of different ways that we can present this information. There's this cash on hand visual here. There's also this cash movement summary that has been quite well received by a number of our clients. And then you saw this in an earlier slide. This is the revenue diversification visual. You also saw this one, the contribution to fixed expenses, along with the relevant commentary. Fundraising efficiency, you saw this one as well, and the donor retention rate, and then all of the other ratios here. Again, very important to mention that none of this can be effectively calculated without good bookkeeping. But once you have that foundation in place, there's a lot of really great information that your Enkel controller will pull together for you in this report. All right, just bear with me for one moment here. So as I've mentioned a few times today, it really all starts with accurate books. So one thing I did want to share with the audience today is that our bookkeeping services now start at $500 a month. This price point has come down, and we're hoping that we will be able to support a number of smaller organizations that we previously couldn't support. But a few important items to consider, whether it's Enkel or not. Really, not-for-profit bookkeeping is different. It does require some level of expertise. What we are able to do is really put your compliance headaches at bay. We can help you keep your financial statements audit ready and compliant throughout the year. We will help you with clarity for your board and funders getting financial reports that make sense. Ultimately, you will save time if you engage Enkel. And what that will mean is more time for you to focus on your mission. We hope to make your year-end process as seamless as possible. And finally, we have NPO expertise. So we have Shirley, of course, on our team on the CFO side. We have a number of controllers. Our bookkeeping team is extensively trained on accounting standards for not-for-profit organizations, which really does allow us to ensure that we're delivering highly accurate financial information to you every month. In terms of what we've presented today, in terms of the reports, the way that we deliver these reports is either on a quarterly basis or a monthly basis. So we have two service offerings. The report is one aspect of it, but very importantly, in this service, you get access to an Enkel controller who will prepare the package for you on either a quarterly or a monthly basis. They will review the results with key stakeholders, highlighting variances, really bringing attention to the numbers that, really do require attention. A mid-quarter check-in or a mid-month check-in, and also addressing advanced accounting issues. So when you engage us for controllership services, your controller does become your eyes and ears on, new grant and how revenue needs to be recognized, really making sure that there's that high level of control and oversight on the books. So if you're interested in learning more about either our bookkeeping services or these services, please feel free to reach out to us and our contact information will be available to you. Also, I did want to share that we are having another webinar on February 27th. Of course, a lot of organizations are thinking about budgeting. Budgeting is an important activity to undertake. It's important to have your budget in place by the beginning of the next fiscal year. And so what we will cover is creating a bulletproof budget for your NPO. We'll walk through how to create a goal-aligned, flexible budget that supports your mission, common budgeting mistakes that nonprofits make and how to avoid them, and why clean bookkeeping is key to effective budgeting. And we will make the link for this webinar available to you in the follow-up materials so that you can go through and sign up right there. But at this time, I'd like to open the floor up to questions. There are always great questions that we get from our audience in these webinars that we do. And so let's jump into it.
Thank you very much. So the first question, how do you recommend organizations determine financial benchmarks?
Shirley, do you want to take
that? That's a great question. I think what you want to do is probably do some research for the particular sector in which you're operating. So, for example, you could be focused on education or health or social services, as the case may be. So I would certainly do some research, but I would also look back to see where you've been in the past and where you want to get to in the next year, because you may want to really, achieve what you believe is the best practice benchmark, but it's going to take a number of years perhaps to get there. And so looking at sort of incremental targets along the way, I think will help you make the improvements that you want to do and achieve sort of ultimately the goal you want on a particular benchmark.
Thank you, Shirley. And then we received several questions surrounding this. Would staffing expenses be considered when calculating efficiency ratios?
Yes, well, I think we looked at the program efficiency ratio, and so you want to think about your complement of staff and which employees work directly in programs and which have more of an administrative role. So when you are looking at your program efficiency ratio, definitely do include those employees that are working on the delivery of specific programs. On the other hand, when you're looking at your administrative ratio, in that case, then I would take into consideration the employees that have an administrative role. Now, of course, you have an executive director who typically has their hands in all of the pies of the organization. We tend to see them more included on perhaps an administrative type side, unless they really are directly involved in delivery of programs.
Yeah, just to add to that, what we see a lot of our clients doing is bucketing their employees in their bookkeeping records into different categories, just so that you can see, who is admin, who is not. And then, of course, that just makes calculating this ratio a lot more straightforward.
Great, thank you. And then the next question, how do you recommend organizations communicate their financial situations in the instance where they experienced a downturn in the previous year?
Shirley, you've been doing a little bit of this lately. I know we've spoken about it. So why don't you take this
one? Yes. Well, that's a very, very broad question. I'm not quite sure who you are anticipating you communicating to. But of course, internally, those communications are really important. Your boards will be meeting at least on a quarterly basis. If there are any circumstances that arise within a quarter, then when a meeting is not taking place, do make sure that you're keeping your board members up to date with any sort of adverse developments. But you may have also want to take the opportunity to try and address the situation, perhaps by launching a sort of fundraising drive, a campaign, trying to elicit additional donations. If you do have different grants in place or different arrangements with perhaps longer standing funders, there may be an ability to go back and to renegotiate and ask for additional funds. I always sort of say that nothing ventured, nothing gained. So it's always good to ask. And also just take that opportunity to be applying for additional grants. There are lots of opportunities available to charities. So do make sure that you're taking advantage of those opportunities.
Thank you, Shirley. And then the next question, this was closer to the beginning of the presentation, but this individual is asking, what is a parent account in relation to categorizing expenses?
Right. Well, I was thinking of particularly of QuickBooks. So QuickBooks has a nice functionality where you can group a number of sub-accounts by setting up what is called a parent account. And then you link those different sub-accounts to the parent account. So you may have set up a number of accounts that are related to your programming. And so what you can do is set up an overall parent account, perhaps called your program expenses, and then have a number of sub-accounts for your different programs under that.
Great, thank you. And then the next question, are there any recommendations for the optimal ratio of restricted and unrestricted funds for nonprofits?
I haven't recently seen any optimal, but at the same time, in the example that we gave you with Make an Impact, the restricted grants in that instance were a very, very high proportion of their overall revenues. And although they had really good diversity underlying that, it still means that they're in a situation where they potentially can't cover all of their administrative expenses by the admin and allocation within those grants. And they then need to raise some unrestricted monies to help cover all of those costs. But it also means that they don't really have the resources perhaps to launch new programs or take on various other initiatives that they may want to do without having specific funding for that. So I would really encourage you to be looking at a ratio that's much lower than 85% when we're looking at restricted revenues in relation to total revenues. Getting closer to that 50% mark is perhaps a good place to aim for.
Great, thank you. And the next question, do you happen to have any recommendations for nonprofits looking to increase their financial transparency with donors and their community?
It's also another great question. I know that many not-for-profits do like to prepare an annual report. That's sometimes available in hard copy, but it's also put on their website. And this is a great way to be communicating to your members, also to the funders. There may be an opportunity when, for example, you're applying for grants to be able to share that information with your donors. It's really a good opportunity to talk about your success stories and also to talk about your future objectives and engage your donors and funders in that way. So I've actually found that generally to be an effective way to communicate.
Thank you, Shirley. And the next question kind of relates to that previous question. So do you happen to have any recommendations for resources to help organizations move toward financial transparency?
I actually have an answer to that. So
Great, come on.
on the next slide, so just before we wrap up, we do have a link to a guide, and you'll receive this in the follow-up email as well from Charity Village, a guide on calculating a lot of what we've discussed today and a little bit more detail. So that can be a really great starting place, I would say, for you on this journey.
Thank you very much. And then the next question, do you happen to have any insights into what would be an effective donor retention rate for nonprofits and charities?
Yeah, I think I'm aware of that 75% ratio as being a target. As I say, for you, if you're finding your ratios lower than that, maybe it's 50%. Working towards a ratio such as 75% over a period of time, I think would be a really good strategy. Some organizations, and really it depends on the size of your organization and the resources you have available, but sometimes employees are specifically tasked with engagement with donors. So they are actually reaching out and communicating to their donors periodically through the course of the year. And also, as I say, sharing the types of information that I mentioned in organizations often put in an annual report. So really being able to tell the story of the impact that they're making on the communities that they're serving.
Thank you, Shirley. And the next question, what are administrative expenses comprised of?
So administrative expenses are generally those expenses that are really critical to your organization but aren't really directly related to a program. So some of them that I can think of, if you do have an office that you're renting, would be rent expenses. That could be things like your office supplies, telephone, utilities, those sort of costs that are really important but aren't dependent on aren't directly related to a specific program.
Thank you, Shirley. And the next question, will you please explain what unrestricted grants are and restricted? So just the difference between the two.
Absolutely. That's also a great question. So a restricted grant is when you receive money from a donor or a funding organization that requires you to spend those funds on a specific purpose. And so within your organization, you may be running a number of programs. Typically, that would be directed to one particular program that you're running. And when you are applying for grants, usually you are specifying the purpose for that. Your program is really described in your grant application. And so when you do receive those funds, the expectation then, of course, is that you're going to spend that on that specific program. So that's restricted. You don't really have the ability to spend it on any of your other programs that are sort of aligned with the mission of the organization. Unrestricted funding, on the other hand, is when you could just receive a donation from somebody and they don't actually specify what they want you to use that donation on. Now, of course, you are sort of restricted in terms of the overall mission of your organization. You're not going to go and spend that money that's outside of your mission, but really you have complete flexibility as to how you wish to spend those monies if it's unrestricted.
Thank you, Shirley. And the next question, how can nonprofits leverage the information covered today to make efficient changes in their organization?
Well, I think you should see yourself as really starting on a journey. And this is really directly related to your financial reporting. And so again, I don't know how often you are meeting with your boards, but I would start to introduce some of these metrics and KPIs as part of the reports that you're delivering to your boards if you're not already doing so. And so doing those calculations, be it monthly or quarterly, and starting to have discussions around it. As we're building this out for many of our clients, it really tells an interesting story and often gives organizations pause to reflect and to say, well, oh, I really didn't know that, and I really need to now make these improvements. So it can be very insightful and beneficial for your organization.
Thank you very much. And then we have a few questions regarding Enkel services. So the first question, regarding the Enkel service package discussed, does the package include payroll management and monthly reconciliation?
Yes, so I had two slides. I had the bookkeeping slide and then the controllership slide with our two different controllership services. So payroll is not included there, but we do have payroll as an extra service offering, an additional service offering. And then we also have, sorry, what was the second part of that question, Mercedes?
So does it include payroll management and monthly reconciliation?
Monthly reconciliation, yes, that's part of our bookkeeping process.
Amazing, thank you. And then the next question that tags onto that, regarding Enkel services, do organizations need to have QuickBooks before they join with you?
No, and many actually don't have QuickBooks when they start working with us. We have clients coming to us that are still working on Excel. We have clients working in desktop software. We will get you set up on QuickBooks Online. Everything from designing your chart of accounts to making sure that the right people have access to the file, to integrating some expense management apps. We can get you set up on QuickBooks.
Great, thank you very much, Omar. And this is the final question about the support. So does Enkel support organizations all across Canada?
Absolutely, yes, in every province and territory.
Incredible. Thank you very much for presenting such an informative webinar. Do you happen to have any final comments before we sign off today?
No, thank you so much for your partnership to Charity Village. We really appreciate this opportunity. As I mentioned, we do have a guide that you will be able to access, but please do feel free to reach out to us for a free consultation to really understand how Enkel's bookkeeping, controllership services, and QuickBooks migration services can really help you optimize your financial operations in 2025. Thank you again, and have a great day, everyone.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. I just wanted to remind everyone that you will receive a follow-up email tomorrow with a link to the webinar recording. Please feel free to share this link with your colleagues. The email will also include a survey link that you can fill out with your feedback on today's webinar. You should see a survey link pop up right here in Zoom following the session as well. On behalf of Charity Village, thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you'll join us for our next free webinar, the Volunteer Management Lifecycle. You can find more information on this and all of our upcoming webinars at charityvillage.com/webinars. Thanks again for joining us. I hope that you enjoy the rest of your day.